Thank you all for joining us again. We appreciate it. Hopefully you had a pleasant break if you were not here. And thanks to everyone in DC for coming back in such a timely fashion. What we've tried to do is take some of the goals that you guys suggested before the break and put them into buckets. Some of these buckets are going to look fairly familiar. And there's one key bucket that I think we're either going to have to say this is now a new bucket or find a way of sort of slotting it in to a parallel work stream and starting to think through this. So as we start to, just get your basic take, we have, again, continuing to define the broader SBOM model. This is tackling questions like naming, vulnerability versus exploitability. Let's have some discussion around integrity. Seems like sort of one of the easiest pieces on the high assurance side to tackle since it won't require coming up with new ways of describing things. Cloud and SaaS, important. We need to sort of, is there anything we want to think about or should we be giving it special treatment compared to how we've been talking about it so far? And then going beyond included for relationships. So we've talked about, for example, instead of included, it could be based on this standard or implements this algorithm or something like that. So we can have more types of data, sort of a longer term approach. So that would be on sort of the, let's continue what we might call practical whiteboarding. Right? That's going from idea to specification. Second, tooling. We've talked about this before. This is documenting the tooling, documenting the gaps, documenting the processes as they relate to the tooling. And one thing that was mentioned this morning was sort of making sure that we can have universal translation tools, right? If we care about the core data, tools that can just say, hey, it doesn't matter what you get. Here's the core. To spit it out for whatever thing that you're worried about, right? If you're focusing on asset and vulnerability management, here's what you need. Demonstrations. We have the healthcare proof of concept is well underway, as we learned this morning. That part is going well. There are other potentials for demonstrations. So again, we talked about auto, the Japanese ministry is very interested in thinking about this, but I think they'd prefer to follow an existing model that we've sort of already validated. And one other approach is I've talked to a number of individual companies who said, we're not sure we want to sort of bring in either our customers or our suppliers, but we're a large enough organization that we think this is an important enough thing for us to do. We're going to try to do it, and we want to do it in such a way that it might be documentable so that others can learn. And so one thing we may want to think about is, are there boundaries or limits for what we want to think of for demonstrations inside this NTI rubric? Do we want a big tent? Or do we want to say, no, you got to have certain features to sort of fall under this shared model? I will share this slide and presumably the slide that makes a lot more sense once you guys are done criticizing this. So we can do that. So, and then I'm going to go to the bottom left here, or bottom right, depending on who's left or right, and look at the awareness and adoption piece. There was a lot in there. We talked about business cases, we talked about the importance of common language, we talked about branding, we talked about more targeted engagement, both for sectors and for roles, and then broader engagement and harmonization. So this is inside technical communities, other standards development organizations, things like that, as well as sort of the global conversation around software supply chain. Right? We are all realizing, we depend on software that we know very little about. Let's get on that. So, and then the new bucket that I've tried to capture from what you were saying this morning was the business processes, which is a little bit similar to how we were talking about tooling, but one, focusing on capturing what already works, especially for internally developed software, mapping SBOM data to sort of the use cases. So I want to do X. What do I need? What do I have? And then thinking about playbooks, making this a little more turnkey for someone to pick up and try. And that could be use case specific, it could be sector specific, it could be technology specific. There are different ways we can slice that up. I wouldn't recommend trying to try all of them at once. A lot of this, as someone mentioned before the break, is just going to depend on who's going to stand up and do the work. But we also want to have a big tent. So that is the attempt of trying to get the broader, some sort of bucketing. Your reactions. Jim, then Duncan.
One thing that jumps out to me under demonstrations is where you have individual companies. Mm-hmm. One of the real benefits from having a multi-stakeholder process is that you get all the parties in the room at the same time. So I'm not saying it shouldn't go on, but I'm not sure that it belongs within our big tent.
Good. I want to tease that thread for a moment. Does anyone have further thoughts about that? So if a very large company, of a large organization says, hey, we want to do this for either our products, or we want to sort of, from if they're a user perspective, say we want to start being able to sort of build out some internal models for using this data, do we want to sort of think about that as, hey, let's try to sync up with that and make sure we can derive benefit from that? Duncan, you have a comment on that.
So this is a 2 on that one, not using my 1 for next in queue. So individual companies would do it as part of this larger group, so they'd share the information with us, because I don't think we should be a blessing or something like that on some private activity. But if they were to do it, hey, this is what we're going to do, you guys tell me what to do, I think it might address some of the concern, because you'd get the value of everyone's experience even though they're just doing the company. So what exactly do you mean by individual companies? That's my question.
Great point. And this is all based on conversations and outreach that I've been doing, trying to get folks moving in this direction. And I don't want to name the organizations, but I like what you're saying. And so, for example, in the healthcare proof of concept, there were circles. There were the folks that were involved in actually executing it, and they did it privately, but they had the pre-conversation in a community, and they also had a post-evaluation and allowed certain amounts of interrogation so they didn't have to share all of their information, but they still, it was a learning process for the community. I also have this dream that we can get a couple of different organizations in the same sector and then say, hey, look, you guys are all interested. Join together. So further thoughts, or anyone on the phone have some thoughts on individual organizations? Michael Eisenberg, you're on the line. Oh, we'll get the screen back in a moment. Travis has just run away. Missy, can we hear from Michael Eisenberg?
Yes, I'm trying to get the line through here.
Oh, thank you.
I apologize.
See if I can unmute him from here. Michael.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Great. This is really back to your point of about 5 minutes ago about individual companies choosing to opt out. I think this relates back to my concern about context and being aware of what's going on with the FASC and with EHS's SCRIM task force, where the working groups there are, among other things, trying to establish criteria for various categories of qualified bidders under new structures that are being discussed. And I think one of the linkages from a theoretical process perspective ought to be any standards being developed under the rubric of the NTIA effort ought to be aware of the approaches being adopted both from the DFARS and the FAR community and DOD and DHS when they talk about what it might take for a vendor to be able to be qualified to sell to a particular customer environment. You may have to provide an SBOM if you want to sell to the government or to some agencies of the government. That could rapidly become a condition of qualification as a qualified vendor.
And I feel fairly confident that both for the FASC and DHS, they'd loop us in pretty quickly, and that's something that I would in turn take to the community. Do you see that, and by the way, Michael's just for right now just talking about U.S. government purchasing requirements. We can scope it broader. Michael, do you see, are there folks that have actively put that on a table with some energy behind them in that context?
Absolutely. There are folks who are discussing, actively discussing whether there needs to be amendment to the DFARS, the Defense Acquisition Regulations, and to the FAR. And if it can't be done through consensus in the FAR Council process, perhaps putting it up to the Hill to making it part of a legislative package to require various attestation elements, including the possibility of bills of material as a requirement. There are already specific contractual bill of material requirements associated with certain categories of sensitive acquisitions. So it's a short leap from some acquisitions to all acquisitions.
Thank you. And I think that speaks to something that was emphasized by a number of people this morning, which was harmonization across different efforts, and we want to make sure that that's something that is on the line. Duncan, you have a comment on the...
I still have a two, and my one is still in queue, just to remember. So with respect to, are there specific DoD regulations? I am not a DoD person, so caveat that first, but I am the chair of the OpenC2 Technical Committee in OASIS, and we're doing a hackathon, whatever the other word, plug fest on OpenC2 at the Defense Innovation thing up in Columbia that I forget its name, in January, that calls out specific DoD FARs, and the specific use case they're doing is a something to connect. It's some DoD buzzword, something to connect. And one of the lines in it specifically is a machine request of the SBOM, response to the SBOM for a device being added to any DoD network. I can't quote you to I could find the documents, but they at least claim it already is a requirement.
So let's keep that in mind. One, because now we have an empirical question that can be answered. And over the last year, we have had many meetings with all of the many different parts of the U.S. government that touch on all of the things that the U.S. government buys. It is a lovely policy lever, but has a lot more complexity than I think those who aren't in the world understand. The second thing I want to flag, what you talked about, is keeping that as an example. When we talk about broader engagement and harmonization, how do we have a process that can capture something like a hackathon? We're like, well, it's just a hackathon, but on the other hand, it's OASIS, and it's OpenC2, and it's got DoD engagement, so making sure that what we start moving towards is something that actually is a way to capture all of this in a meaningful way, and ideally has some ongoing process to say, what happened there? Is this information up to date? Right? It's a simple spreadsheet or Google Doc will quickly get stale for that kind of data collection. So, I want to pop stack. We're returning to this question of demonstrations, and I'm going to push on this a little further because in some ways this is one of the easier buckets to talk about. Right? The healthcare proof of concept is going to go forward. They've created a path that the world can follow or riff upon. One question that I have for you is, how much broader organization should we try to impose, right? I think Jim and Duncan and sort of hit upon the idea that, okay, to sort of be an NTIA proof of concept or whatever we want to call it, there's certain openness and sharing that happens. Does the healthcare group want to have a subgroup that helps other people get set up? So it will be less on your operational world, but so folks can track that, or do you think we should just have, a group that meets much less regularly but is still tracking it, other than just having NTI keep track of it and having those people give updates whenever we have our meetings? Do you have thoughts about how you'd like to organize that? Jim?
That is one of the things we have discussed in planning going forward. That is not just the proof of concept, but taking the lessons learned from that and coming up with a SBOM for dummies, kind of approach.
Okay, so almost some of the playbook style, but built to the, how to have the talk about you want to do. So you want to do an SBOM proof of concept.
Yeah, it's just one of the things we've mentioned, that it's not on a permanent list of topics to cover, but it did come up.
So we've got a decent number of folks from that working group here and more on the phone. Is this something that you feel, at least from the gate, you feel comfortable taking some of your time and energy in sort of helping to, someone says, oh, we're thinking of doing an SBOM, they'll come to some manifestation of your working group, talk about it, get feedback?
Yeah, I think it's one way that people or groups that aren't participating directly in the execution of the SBOM can contribute strongly.
Any further thoughts about that?
I'd rather prefer the small sub-working group of that group that can take somebody under their wing as needed and say, here are the high-level concepts, and then let's break those down and make sure that you're set up for success. But I see that as an ad hoc working group as needed when people show up and want that information, more so than some publication that, hey, this is the pamphlet, how to do an SBOM kind of thing.
Nice. Kate.
So you're sort of thinking that there's a mentoring group that's sort of sitting on standby for someone to ask for help?
Yeah, kind of. Like, just as part of the healthcare proof of concept, I would imagine we could ask, hey, does 2 or 3 people have a couple of minutes to sit down for a half-an-hour phone call and talk somebody through a proof of concept? And I'm sure that I would always volunteer and bring a couple other people involved, and down the road we go.
Okay. Any further thoughts on having sort of the healthcare group be the primary contact or sort of the primary point, and as that evolves, we can revisit that question? Anyone on the phone? Remember, you hit *1, and we can hear from you. Operators are standing by. Call now. Okay, we're now popping stack. So we've got the demonstrations part handled. That's good. Duncan, you have a finger.
My finger was from.
Yep. Oh, sorry, use the mic.
Apologies. One of the topics that gets discussed that I don't see anywhere on the board is this concept of who are we missing, both what sectors are we missing and what other companies in the sectors that we already have are we doing. So that sort of applies to, I'll say, each of the components, but then taking that particular topic and applying it to demonstrations. Is the demonstration bucket the documentation of known demonstrations that you already have in the works, or is it allowed to include demonstrations we wish we had that we should go out and search for? Because if we could add some more bullets for that, I would propose I'd propose a financial sector one, not because they need the concept proved, because we need to learn everything they've already done from doing it. So it might even be beyond the word proof of concept, since they already do a lot of this stuff, but it would still be a proof of concept from our viewpoint to share lessons back with us. So getting some of the financial sector would be one of them. Another one I personally would really like to see, I realize I carry no weight anymore because I'm just an old retired guy, so I can't speak for AT&T anymore, but I'll pretend I could speak for them and say I wish there was a security industry demonstration, because the cobbler's children go barefoot a lot, and if anybody should be doing this right, it should be the $1 trillion we're spending on security gear, which brings me to the comment I sort of made as a throwaway before, but I'll now make explicitly under demonstrations. The DoD is doing an open to everybody plug fest in January that does have this, I haven't found the word yet, something to connect use case in it that does require you to return an SBOM as part of an OpenC2 command before you'll be allowed to connect to any DoD network. And it's being done at I found at least the name of it. It's being done at the Dreamport facility in Columbia, which is Cyber Command's open lab for working with everybody. So I would argue that probably Plugfest could get thrown on the demonstrations. Just if this group's willing to do it, I think I can speak for that group. I'll have to run it by them, but I'm their chair, so I think I can say that the more the merrier. So if anybody does want to sort of learn from that and do it, but it is a particular use case for a particular need to basically do a command reply of what is your SBOM.
I like it. And something that touches also things that aren't on the list is how do you deliver an SBOM? Something that a bunch of the groups have identified. And I don't think we actually got to this morning, but it's come up in a bunch of different groups. Which is both a transport layer question as well as an operational question. So there are going to be sectors where people still will say, we're not comfortable making our SBOM public. We will share it with our downstream users. And of course, there are areas where that is a meaningless comment, like the world of OSS. So, in light of the other thing, Duncan, that you flagged is sort of who are we missing, and I think that's also a good approach, which is we want to do both broadening and potentially targeting in the awareness and adoption side of things. And we want to make sure we can get some time to do that today to sort of start spitting things out. On the financial side of things, we are speaking to 2 very large American financial institutions about doing something in the space. They are free to chime in if they so choose over the course of the day. Further comments, or what isn't up there that you feel should be a broad goal that we may have talked about or that you just thought of over lunch? Charlie.
There's Bob's concern about high certainty or high
assurance.
High assurance, thank you. Mm-hmm. I don't see that up there.
No, that's a great point. I started with integrity as the most manageable part, but there's a lot of other work that can be done on the high assurance side of things. Duncan.
And so along those notes, is the way it's worded implied we don't need any more use cases, or is the way it worded that use cases are in the business process stuff? Because I would not argue we're done with, we've defined every use case that we could ever care about.
I think that's true. A lot of the work and attention has really been around a few very clear ones. And this is, I will turn this back to you, right? There's always a trade-off, which is, do you want to, this morning, we talked about the importance of processes. Everything from make it easy for people to do, make it cheap for people to do, demonstrate that it's worth their while, but that means you're doing it against stuff that we already understand. So are we going to be exploiting or exploring, for those of you who are familiar with James March's organizational trade-off model? So do you want to focus on the use cases that have come up over and over again, or do you want to say, let's go broader?
Well, I'll make a case for we should 80-20 rule, go for the 80. However, whenever we reach an objection to, oh, but that doesn't apply to my case because, we should at least look at those particular becauses of interest to people in the room.
Good. Thank you. Other thoughts of our bucketing model here? Business processes still sort of, at least in my mind, I haven't quite figured out how that fits in, whether that should be something that is separate to focus on, or whether it's something that's folded into one of these other things that we have in front of us. Really hoping that'd be an easy question. You just say you're an idiot. This is the answer. Charlie.
In the interest of fewer things to do, we might want to roll it into another area. We might want to roll that into how do we adapt our current procurement process, for example, to the new SBOM regime.
Jesus, that's another one that's not up there. Sorry. We talked about it a lot this morning. Yes.
Does that answer your question?
So,
am I getting this right?
You said, let's take it and fold it into one of the other buckets. So let's talk about how this maps to it. The rough organization that I think kind of came out of the September discussion and then follow-on discussions is much of what we have to do kind of maps to what we have today. We've got a group that's focusing on standards and building things, so let's have them sort of think through the tooling side of things. Makes sense. Similarly, on the group that is focused on some of the benefits and the roles of SBOMs across the ecosystem, they have an ecosystem perspective. Makes sense that they can think about awareness and adoption. There's a lot of work to be done in that bucket, but it sort of seemed like a reasonable fit. Similarly, the work that Michelle and Art did of actually taking fuzzy issues and making them a little more concrete and speccing out this SBOM could be a good fit for these new challenges, or not. Lori.
I would have a comment on the business cases there, is that if you take into the three subgroups which we have right now is the consumer, integrator, and the developer, then the business case is completely different for them, I think. And it should be kind of like and it comes to the actually closer also to the branding side. So you want to be maybe focusing on those groups separately in a way that it is most appealing for each of the group. But in the back end, they should be tied together so it would work for SBOM.
No, and maybe I may be working back. To me, it kind of ties off of what was just said. One thing I don't see up here are associated risk models or development of risk models along with an SBOM and what the outcome of that is and how an organization should view that, manage that, perform that risk models. So I don't know if we've missed something or in previous discussions it was included as a different item, but.
So are you saying risk model as this is an impetus to drive SBOM creation and use, or risk model as in here are the risks of SBOM practices?
The first one, less the second, and I'll add a third, which is an organization receives an SBOM, they look at the bill of materials, what are they using to measure risk? Mm-hmm. How are they associating that with each of those items?
I have been involved in too many very late night conversations at security conferences to want to wander down into the what is risk, which is not to say that you guys shouldn't also do that. There's a lot more smarts in this room that we have today. One way of thinking about it that could be helpful is to say, let's draw the cutoff, which is, so for example, when we've talked about vulnerabilities, we've just assumed that there's going to be a source of vulnerabilities that people have. We're not going to argue about NVD, private feed, whatever you want. You've got your own personal hacker in your living room who just gives you vulnerabilities. That's fine too. You're going to have a source and this is using it. So one thing is just to sort of say, we're going to dock it into that. Another is to say, no, we're going to go further and actually provide some guidance on how someone should be treating the risk.
Not necessarily just treating, but how are you even measuring? How does an organization consume this information and make it measurable for their organization?
So it's not just how will they consume it. It's how will they consume it and then demonstrate its value or measure its impact.
Measure its impact. Yep.
Measure its impact. Yep. I've got two people who've been thinking a lot about this issue. Yes.
So I think that's already on the board, because I think anything to do with a business case is associated with the whole reason we're doing an SBOM is to mitigate some risk in the first place, and there's a risk that's already existent, and you're going to spend a certain amount of money to make it less of a risk. That's what the business case is for. And with that, you have to take into account all the pros and cons. So I think it covers all three of the cases he mentioned. It may not be explicitly called out, but that's what I would think a business case is for in the first place.
I've got a bouncing art and then a Charlie. Yeah.
Yeah, so just not a strong comment, but I personally sort of draw the line at, to Alan's point, how you do your risk assessment is a very interesting and huge problem, but look, we're going to get you data, now you can do a better job. Just for somewhere to draw a scope line, that's kind of where I put it. Not saying we should, but that's kind of my thought, that's all.
Charlie, but very first I'm going to chime in and say, we are aware of the lag between video and voice. I've just had a call with our friendly tech, and we're going to work very hard to make sure that the next time we have one of these, that lag won't be there. And I apologize to those of you who are watching and or listening or trying to do both at the same time and getting very frustrated. Charlie.
I would simply like to agree with Art. I think that he hit it right on the head. Risk assessment is a totally separate subspecies that we could really get bogged down in, I think. That's my opinion.
So you're right, Art, because when we first started this and as we were going through our proof of concept, we actually came through this and decided that we would draw the line there, right? And that we would see if there was value. So the HDO did take the proof of concept piece, and they tried to determine if there's value on their side for it, but it wasn't meant for us to spin wheels forever. I do have one other comment on the slide if we don't have anybody else to interject on that.
So we'll have your comment, and then we'll continue to plug away at the business processes question.
Well, I'm going to derail you if I do that. I'll come back to it. Mine is this. I was just sitting here thinking about this. We have this demonstrations piece that says healthcare in Japan, and I wonder if we should actually be looking a little more broad, not just Japan in general, because we do have this issue where we've got regulators just throwing acronyms and initialisms out for like CBOM or SBOM or whatever. So now we've got to address what does that mean for someone like Health Canada? Is it the same thing that we're doing today? They just called it CBOM. Because when you read their definitions, it is the actual, it really isn't more than what we're doing today, right? So they just tend to use a different one, which tends to be different meaning for people in the room. So
I think this is, when we think about mapping them, so on the demonstration side at the moment is right now it's been targets of opportunity, right? It's the folks that we've had a chance to talk to and find, fertile ground, interested ears. And so that's why sort of I flagged that up there. It's in a question mark because it's very, very far from being settled, but reasonably high-level meeting with both the Japanese government and industry. There's, we like this idea of SBOM. We want to move forward. We like the non-regulatory approach. But they also said, we want to follow the model to show that we can replicate it. And right now what there's to replicate is the work that you guys did. See, this is the problem of you guys actually being successful is going to have that. Mike. Yes, the sincerest form of flattery.
Or plagiarism.
I want to poke at business process for a little bit more and see if folks have a better way of thinking about it or capturing what you'd like to do. Because I think there was a lot of very interesting ideas that were brought up this morning on one, let's make it easy and accessible for people to do from a playbook perspective, and that, I think, maps quite nicely with the making the benefits argument for, or the economic case for, if you will. And a lot of that, I think, is a little specific to use case, sector, tech, et cetera. And, once you get that many different dimensions, you get combinatoric very quickly. Duncan.
Yeah, so given all that, I'm having trouble distinguishing how certain things go in the top bucket from the bottom bucket. I do see what you call business processes tied in with the awareness adoption, and it's the next level down of it that you got to decide. Do you divide it by industry or whatever? Not if you were thinking of these as different groups. I'm not positive business processes is a different group than awareness adoption. I'm also not positive business processes is the right term. Mm-hmm. I know what you mean by it, but I don't think it's going to play right.
Let the record reflect that a bunch of people just did a very quiet under their breath. Vijay, and then we go to Josh on the phone.
Yeah, we struggle with that. I was just talking to Art about that. We went to SPOM processes instead of business processes as one of the titles in our section, because we want to be clear that that is a big scope too when you say business processes. There's so many areas SPOM can impact. We just want to focus on what are the SPOM processes that support whatever is the business processes going to be.
You can sort of see it's sort of a little bit under awareness and adoption, and it's still, but at the same time, that's going to be a little more, it's going to be more substantive and hands-on than some of the higher level discussion around common language, branding, or less global in scope compared to all of the harmonization work. Josh, on the phone.
Can you hear me?
We can.
All right, there's been a bit of a lag, so the conversation moved a little bit, but I agree that risk management should be out of scope in general. I do think there might be a friendly amendment or an olive branch, which could be, we already talked about a 5 stages of grief kind of thing or whatnot. Perhaps we could also have a do's and don'ts for getting started, like, here's a great use of an SBOM in procurement, here's a terrible use of an SBOM in procurement, here's a couple, risk frameworks one could use this as an input to, but should not be the input to. Something like a one-pager on getting started do's and don'ts might be in a middle ground between taking on a huge undertaking that we should not versus leaving people to bang on their vendors for hundreds of potential vulnerabilities. We could maybe nudge them away from the latter.
And so, Josh, forgive me because we can't show the slides require the video for it. Do you see a role for having the discussion around business processes, how organizations should actually start to use, implement, create,
the playbook,
et cetera?
Part of a playbook could be do's and don'ts.
Yep.
See your slides, they're just very lagged. So they're up right now. But
excellent. And so is playbook something that we should sort of set up and have a focused group of people thinking through playbooks?
It doesn't have to be the playbook, by the way. You just asked me a specific question, so I gave you a specific answer. It could be part of the FAQ, could be a do's and don'ts, or myth busting. But if we anticipate, to Duncan's 80-20 rule idea, if we can anticipate a common misconception, we can blunt a couple common misconceptions without having a huge work stream.
And I think you've helped sort of clarify some of the differences. There's some of the broader communication that we need to do, right? Which is myth-busting, FAQs, having some documentation that's sort of helpful to communicate awareness and adoption. And then there's the more targeted, when someone, the story that I've been telling about what we don't have today is if we get, someone who's running a large open source project or someone who, makes software, someone who uses software says, I've got buy-in from leadership, I've got funding, I've got people, what do I do? We don't have that yet today. And that seems like a thing that I heard this morning you wanted. And so one of the questions I'm going to put it to you, since that's something we haven't really thought through how we would do that, is how would we do that?
I mean, you're going to get to this elsewhere, but we talked about templates for presentations at conferences that people could derive from. These could be a single slide each for do's and don'ts, common misconceptions. They could be digestible one-pagers in an FAQ. I don't think they're that hard. I don't think they'll be that controversial. And I don't think they'll take multiple months of edits. I think the shorter the better. And there's probably a minimum list of what those are.
Yeah, and I think that work, at least as I look at the landscape, makes sense to sort of slot under the broader awareness and adoption side of things.
Agreed.
Is that enough when you guys are talking about processes or playbooks or rubrics or whatever the term, we came up with a bunch of terms, is that sufficient, or do we need to have something more? And do we want to do that more now?
I hate to use Josh Corman bingo, but in the spirit of crawl, walk, run, it could even be an on-ramp or a journey, like start small, start on this type of thing. Just like Sunil early in our process said, they went from asking, do you have a SBOM binary, yes, no, and discount, to scrutinizing its contents relative to its peers, and even having that, blocked technology list, the prohibited technology list. So perhaps, again, another one-pager could be how to start small, how to scale, what advanced might look like, so people realize it doesn't have to be a binary, super heavy lift. You can do this for just one type of purchasing.
I hear Josh proposing an SBOM, the SBOM maturity model.
Yeah. I'll go to mute now. Thank you.
Duncan.
It's a little bit tangential, but somewhat related on the how to get started issue. So I personally have grappled with that issue. I'm trying to actually build a Raspberry Pi prototype for this Dreamport thing that's coming up in January. And by the way, I did find it's Public Law 114-328-December 23rd, 2016, Section 1653, at least as interpreted by Cyber Command, requires to connect to DoD networks, you need to have an SBOM. And that's what they're trying to implement over the next couple of years. So I'm trying to build something for that. So I'm trying to actually make one myself, and it's hard because you got to figure out how to start. And one of the problems I'm having, so I assume many others might have the same, is there's all these common components that you'd think someone would have done this already on, but they haven't. That I don't know if there's any way we collectively could sort of jumpstart that of, at least for this Linux distribution, let's somebody have one and let's share it. So I don't know. I think that would help with this sort of monumental hurdle you got to get over to get started.
I have two leaders from the open source world having reached for their buttons. I think Kate was a little first, and then Brendan.
So there's a project called Clearly Defined, which basically goes in and logs the analysis of components. And so it's an OSI-approved project, and it's being sponsored by Microsoft and a few others for, after the scannings are done, they basically are logging things. So there's some places where people are trying to start sharing the logging and sharing the component information.
We've got a bucket for it and everything. Harmonization across technical communities.
No, this is the actual.
Right, no. So you want the data. And so, but to get that data, we need to figure out where the data is. Yes. Brendan.
So
Much of this data is available already in our API. Sorry, I work for a small sticker printing company that hosts some software. And
for those of you listening on the phone, Brendan is just...
It's GitHub. So you can pull this data out of our API right now. It just doesn't come out in one of the SBOM approved formats. We have not yet announced that we are going to do it in an SBOM approved format.
Very glad you were, again, could you circulate how to find it?
It's literally in our API documentation.
You have a really lot of API documentation.
But yeah, talk to me afterward. Yeah.
So we're discovering that this is a complex, multifaceted challenge here. I'm going to pull you away from, well, first we've got Michael Eisenberg on the phone, and then we'll take another stab. Michael.
I'm really back to the risk discussion. And while I understand the reticence about having SBOMs inject new risk into or require a separate risk assessment, I think going back to some comments this morning about the quality of the SBOM itself and protecting the integrity of the bill of materials, any review of a standard, I think, the quality of the standard should consider making sure that the SBOM doesn't inject new risk because of its lack of ability to be validated. We don't want the SBOM to become a new source of risk.
No, yeah, agree completely. It is. If we want to use it as something more than keeping honest people honest, then having the basic integrity, and that's sort of one of the things, which is a great segue, since we're making a lot of progress on the business process side of things. We're going to go and take a look at sort of defining and refining the model. And Michael, one of the things that's up there is integrity. We also this morning talked about naming. We talked about vulnerability versus exploitability. We talked about the differences for different types of technology, especially beyond on-prem or embedded, and also even expanding beyond this. So that's a lot of work, right? Those of you who are involved in writing the framing document know that even just taking something as simple as, guys, what's an SBOM, took some decent skull sweat, right? There were a lot of interesting corner cases to explore. Most of them were carved out. Jim.
Could you just define the last point there, expanding beyond included?
So right now, a graph. Oh, Art, go for it.
I believe this is, so in the framing document, at least so far, we simplified that there's one relationship that a component is included in another component. But all along, there's been discussion that there's not enough nuance in that one gross type of relationship. I think this is it. Even recently, sort of derived from or based on has become something that would be useful to capture. And I'm pretty sure that SPDX already supports more than the include relationship anyway. So it's common knowledge you might need more relationship types. We just have one to start with. I think that's the answer, Alan?
Yeah.
Is that your answer? Is that? Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, and I'll also point out that SWID has more than just the one type of relationship, too. There's a bunch of relationships there, too. So, yes, there are. I've done the spreadsheet.
and so, right, but again, not all of, but a lot of what we've talked about has still been built around the notion of its components and their relationships to each other in a particular, changing the number of relationships means we've now added a whole nother dimension into what we're trying to capture. Complexity is important. It's how you get verisimilitude, but it also makes things a lot harder, need more tools, challenges for adoption, etc. So I'm looking up at the upper left corner here. So this is, hey, one, are we happy for what we are now? Like one way that I could read the conversation this morning. So you know what? The baseline SBOM, as you guys defined it, that's going to be good, and right now we should focus on the other things. That's one approach. Another approach could be, there's still more work that we want to make this easily adoptable at the first pass. And so we need to do some further refinement of this SBOM model, not just extend it, but further refine it. And so that's something that you guys want to do. Kate.
One of the areas that doesn't seem to be well defined in right now is the integrity, the pedigree, the provenance. People, I keep on saying they want it, but no one's been very explicit about what it is. It is. And getting those fields nailed down to something a little bit more concrete and specific means that some of the tooling can actually start to implement it.
And so I think the final, there's an appendix in the use case document that I think is a solid first start of at least describing their goals. Part of it is, right, integrity, we understand, right, signing, we also understand signing known hard problem to solve in a completely general case. The challenge once we get to pedigree and provenance, and I'm happy to let some of the folks in the room chime in and some of the folks in the call chime in, is it also means we need the data ontologies as well. Right? We can't build tools until we understand how are you trying to characterize every developer tool in the world or every developer key in the world? We don't have what would go in those fields in a well-defined way. I've got 1, 2, 3.
So again, not an expert in the area. I don't know if Bob Martin's on the call and can chime in, but my belief is NITRE has brought to a standards body, OMG, something that's going to get adopted next week that answers all these questions. So I'll let them answer.
I'm actually sitting in on that, and no, it's gotten pushed out. That's why I know there's a problem that needs to be sorted.
Yes. And there's going to be a meeting in December for those who want to touch on that, but it's also going to be touching on CI/CD stuff, a lot of good things. Michelle, did you have a comment that was on this particular topic?
No.
Okay, I'm going to come
It's
back
an
to you in a
additional
moment.
one.
So I think the harmonization is sort of a inverse harmonization. We should assign some of these things to other bodies who can take care of it. Naming in particular. There's got to be a software best practice out there about naming. Got to be at some point. Maybe we should try to
We all thought so.
Yeah.
Right, there wasn't one, so they developed CPE, and NIST's official position, and I believe so, I will validate this with Dave Waltermeyer, is that the replacement for CPE was going to be decentralized through SWID.
Maybe that's the answer, but the bottom line is, I guess we don't have to worry about it. We should say, okay, that's going to be solved at some point by someone, and we need to adopt it when that's done.
Art, I'm going to point to you on this just because I know that you and I spent a long time poking.
So I was actually on some of those calls too.
Sure, absolutely. And I mean, a number of us are in this space already. I'm not aware of a solution that exists or is likely to jump into this space. I think it might be what we are doing. I do believe other domains in the world have solved global ID. You can generate a GUID. Books have ISBN number. There are attempts at this in the rest of the world. We should learn from them. But it's we're ultimately, I think, trying to uniquely identify every piece of software on the planet. That's kind of hard. So
sure,
it's super easy. Everyone else should just do what I do.
But is it really the job of a all volunteer once a week organization? Or I mean,
who else is? Anyone else doing it? If someone is, let's get behind them.
I guess my point was we should assign it to someone. ISO or NIST or somebody should, get it done.
The two organizations that I've suggested, FIRST and Ikezi, both said nope.
Too hard.
Yeah. Duncan.
I attend ITU, and I'm sure they'd love to solve this problem for you, and I'm sure you don't want that for an answer. So be careful what you ask for when you say assign it to someone else. But my point was actually going to be on that naming one. I agree with what everyone else said, that I don't think it's a solved problem yet. Therefore, we have to at least include it in our space to get it solved somehow, whether we do it or not. But I would actually argue that the especially proprietary it's actually just a naming in general problem. I would have thought open source, this wouldn't be as much of a problem, but I think the healthcare POC, and I know the work I'm trying to do, it's actually a problem even when it shouldn't be in open source, just because people are stupid because there isn't some rule that tells you can't rename it.
And right, it's does the supplier go back to the community that in the last 3 years has actually organized itself and is following, has their Linux Foundation badges? Yeah.
Yeah, CI badge. Yeah.
But that still means getting the commercial supplier to go back and follow those practices. Aha, a commercial supplier.
No, I would say that we could hand it off to somebody else and just let it languish out there forever, or we can force it to happen. And there has to be some legitimate reason to force it to happen. And if we can provide enough impetus for that, then that solves it, so to speak. But it may not end up where we want it to be, but at least we'll get some solution.
I can see that my opinion is probably in the minority, but I do think that it can be a rat hole that will suck us in and be all-consuming and ultimately unsolved, right?
Is there?
Yeah.
So we've got Bruce on the line, who has also been tackling this issue. Oops. Missy, can we get Bruce?
Hello?
Hey, Bruce.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, cool. I think everyone has to understand that it's essential to get the naming problem solved, at least for suppliers. Otherwise, there's no point in doing this, because if you don't know who the supplier is, what point is it to know, what the components are? It has to be solved. And, there's no point in proceeding if there's not a will to solve this problem, at least for the suppliers.
And so, Bruce, is this the sort of thing that you think the solution is envisionable? Like, we can say, here are 6 different ways that you can do it. We understand that everyone has their own things. We're going to basically take the N most popular ways through some sort of, outreach, find out what's already there, and at least we can narrow the naming space and then point to people and say, you got to do one of these. Is that type of solution achievable, or do you think we can even narrow it further?
I think the main problem is getting someone to agree to take it on. There's lots of solutions. You said, is there 6? Yeah. But there's lots of solutions. And I think that the main issue is getting someone to take it on. You said you talked to First and somebody else, but, that's the problem. Because if we don't know if we don't know who owns the components, who's the supplier of the components, what point is there having an SBOM?
Yeah. Okay.
I think it's also not so much just getting ownership, but okay, if someone comes up with something, will everyone else adopt it? I think making sure that we actually build consensus and getting it adopted, because there's a lot of ideas floating out there, but we really haven't standardized on a bunch of things yet.
And I'm gonna push you further on that, because I agree completely. There are great ideas for naming software out there, but they're mutually exclusive and they all involve everyone following the same model. Is there a path towards consensus that even if it doesn't get us something perfect, gets it to the sort of thing that we can start to throw tools at?
So there's 2 out there that are getting close. From what I'm seeing, there's a package URL, which we looked at, and that gets us a good portion of it there. And then there's the software heritage IDs, which are basically, again, an encryption ID that's used to reference software that has been logged. And so those are 2 approaches that are out there towards identification and being able to be authentic about it, that are worth starting points.
And love both of those, but at the same time, hard for me to imagine the folks who are building and shipping software to go back and retrofit to get the long cryptographic strings. Right, CI/CD world, great.
Perl doesn't require the long cryptographic strings, but like what we've got in baseline calls for those 4 elements. And, okay, we've sort of defined what is effectively unique, and no one's been able to throw rocks at the 4 definitions.
I've got Brendan and then Art.
And just to clarify, the PURL allows for what we discussed in the last in-person meeting of essentially a list of aliases of registries, where you could have, basically GitHub says this thing is called this, NPM says this thing is called X, and that would just work with the PURL, right?
And it's the same thing in this case?
It really is. Yeah.
So just to be very clear, the same software component has two PURLs.
That's what I'm asking. Would that be, is that a correct interpretation of PURL?
As long as you include the hash, so you could actually get the mapping. You don't obviously always have to include the hash. That's the issue, though.
Okay.
It's an optional component on the pearls. But that's the only way you could get.
Jim.
I'm close to saying, screw it, let's do it live.
That's what yes. So
yeah.
The framing baseline stuff was, I looked at Perl. I didn't look at software heritage very carefully. But I don't, it's a theory, right? Do those 7 things, if you have enough of them, does that give you uniqueness? Do you have the hash? Is that good enough? I think we need to try it. Someone needs to test this to figure out if it's just garbage or not. And then if we can hopefully achieve the slightly higher layer and say, you can use package URL, you can use the heritage IDs, you can use something else, they meet the meta criteria, that's our chance at making it global without everyone having to re-engineer their individual spec at their favorite spec. Needs to be tested, or else it's just hot air, though.
It needs to be tested, and the other thing is it needs to be mappable to other sources of existing data.
Yes.
Right, that's the final piece, which is, right, it's not just that I have the software, I need to say I have software that I care about for X reasons, and that data source needs to either have people who buy in, so we get new fields in the NVD, or some other model. Duncan.
Yeah, I was going to say, though, I don't think we have to solve world hunger. We only have to solve one by a time. So we don't have to solve all problems that have existed since the dawn of software. We have to solve from some point forward on this subset. So just because I could have interpreted your statement to, it has to work with everything that's ever been done, and I don't think that's true.
Less that, but it does have to work with the people in this room who are shipping software with components that, right, may not currently be, have communities that are going to change all the names for them.
You're saying if we can't solve everybody in this room's all their problems, we shouldn't do anything?
I would say the challenge of the naming problem.
That is the challenge. I agree.
Is that if we can't get the container world and Jim's blinking boxes to both work with the same tools, then we still have the naming problem.
We still have problems.
Yeah.
But maybe less problems than we had if we didn't do anything.
I think that's a good way of thinking about it. Can we shrink the problem space?
Yeah, and from a proof of concept standpoint, all we need to do, but all that is necessary to successfully get through a proof of concept is that both sides are talking the same language when it comes to naming.
Good.
It doesn't have to be global. It doesn't have to be every software package out there, but it has to be the ones that that will be used for the proof of concept.
All right. I am hearing that this group, that there is going to be a group of people that are going to be tackling naming. I want to move forward in that direction to figure out how we're going to be doing that. So Josh and Bruce, quick comments. Josh first. Oops.
If we don't know the manufacturer, it is not zero value, or it's not what's the point. There's plenty if you just take for Java, for example, the highly deterministic coordinating system of group attribute version, those binaries that are shared around through Maven Central are very, very useful for most of the open source attacks in the wild, and they aren't prone to as many different synonyms and also known ases and whatnot. So even if this is most valuable on deterministic coordinate systems and binaries, and increasingly valuable as other naming structures get adopted on a go-forward basis, we shouldn't pretend it's no value. Grepping to see if you're vulnerable to a JBoss flaw or an Apache Struts 2 flaw can be done even without these consistent namings of the manufacturer. And Duncan made my other point better than I would, so I'll just yield.
Thank you. We'll come back to you, I'm sure. Bruce.
I think that there's been some discussion about formats, and I think what's really important is that somebody somewhere that you can go to has a mapping between the supplier and some string. I don't think it matters what. After that, we can start working on alias problems. But the first problem, which is, a mapping between some string and a supplier, I mean, that has to be solved, and there has to be an entity that does that. Or we've got to set it up somehow so it happens. And after that, formats and everything will follow easily, I think, or a lot more easily.
Do you have, assuming that the ball could get rolling through some other force, maybe this force, do you have an entity in mind that could maintain that mapping?
Well, I thought first would be a good one, but I mean, I don't care. I mean, if GitHub could do it somehow, that would be fine. Or any of the other organizations that are online. I don't really care which organization.
All right, so I'm going to take from this the sense that naming is still in the critical path. And we're going to spend some time trying to address it. So the next question is, does the framing group stay in existence, focusing on tackling this and some of the other issues that we still have open? And it could just be, you could only focus on the ones that are super, super important. Right, so should we have, right, Art, I'm going to poke at you with this, or are there bigger priorities that you want to focus on personally?
I've just sort of said this already, so I'll stick to it for the moment. I think someone in this room, someone in this room virtually in this effort should be continuing to work on the naming problem, the identification problem. Again, not to necessarily say there isn't another one we could get behind or borrow or steal or use, but it needs more work. I don't see anyone else doing it. I'm familiar with the organizational things at first. I don't think that's the right. I don't know another standards organization that this is a good place for. You have to build the thing first, and then you might want to maybe go get it standardized if it's been proven is the proper order for standardizing things. So I won't speak for the entire framing group, but someone here needs to do it. I'm willing to personally work on it, whether that's part of the framing group or an ad hoc or something else. I'm not sure yet, but it should be worked on in this group, is my opinion.
Thank you. And the other thing that is beneficial about FIRST as an organization to start working is they have active participation from both open source and commercial communities as well as users. So you can talk about it.
Yeah, sorry. I'm very familiar with FIRST. I'm a member and I chair a couple of working groups there, or co-chair them. My concern there is that's a benefit you just described. It is also a largely volunteer. The working groups are largely volunteer within FIRST, so I would be concerned in advance of enough momentum and buy-in and time on the problem. That's not to say it's not an option, but I don't see it as an easy answer for FIRST. Mm-hmm. That's all.
Thank you.
We're not trying to solve it here.
Brendan, okay, so
do more. I don't know if it's
we have
this meeting.
Commitment to focusing on naming.
First is the right place.
Two options that are flagged are, one, we try to sort of have a ad hoc naming group, smaller, focused, and trying to tackle it, which could then sort of spit out, here are three things that we could do, or something. Another approach is to say we're going to keep what we've called the framing group and have them continue to tackle naming, vulnerability, exploitability. The one thing that's not up there is distribution of SBOMs. And the way that I think of this is, right, this is not going to solve all of these, but do the whiteboard specification of rigorous thinking around it. And try to capture as many different perspectives, raise the problems and say, okay, we can solve it in this way. What can we solve? What can't we solve?
Point of order question.
Please.
Are you asking, on this very specific case, do we want one working group or 5 ad hoc groups? Or are you asking generically, once we get into all this stuff, is our sort of way of thinking a bunch of small groups or a few big groups? Because I think I'm more leaning towards we should solve the big question of do we want a bunch of little groups or a few big groups before we get into naming versus integrity.
Good. Nope. And I like where you're taking that, so we'll continue that. You've suggested we could have, instead of having 4 plus or minus 1 working groups, we could have more smaller targeted groups. Do you have an opinion on that?
I'll say personally, I like the more smaller groups. I can only go to the ones I care about wearing one side of my head, but I'm schizophrenic because the other side of the head, it sounds like an organizational nightmare if we're going to have 14 groups to figure out who's meeting when so that this one doesn't conflict with that one on whose bridge and whatever.
And Duncan, I know you well enough to know that you will have a lot more interest in more than 4 of them if we have a lot of small groups. I also agree that from a management perspective, making sure that we have organization deconflict for many groups will be tricky. I've got Jim and then Michelle.
Yeah, I think these small set of things that need to be resolved, most of them may be on that chart already, should be done under the umbrella of, it can still be multiple groups, multiple small groups working on it. Whoever's interested in the topic of naming can participate in naming, for instance, but it should be collected all into the group that's resolving these outstanding issues.
Michelle?
Yeah, so I guess I'll use this opportunity to raise a larger concern on making sure that we cover this in phase 2, maybe a little bit better than we covered it in phase 1, which is coordination, right? I'm going
to hold you off on that because I agree completely that cross-group coordination is really important, but I do want to actually start to do some of the bucketing on the groups.
That was my only part of that.
Good.
Coordination, then period, and then I was going to make my point.
I'm so sorry. Thank you.
That's okay. So I don't think we want one big group trying to tackle all these things, nor do I think we want 14 groups, right? Because I think that there's a happy medium. I think we had a good number of groups, and you take these and bucket them into appropriate umbrellas of, you're not going to create a group for each of these, but each of these could be targeted to either existing or overturn of a group, right? So we have 4 groups, maybe the scope of one of those groups changes a little bit to be able to accommodate some of these, but I think we've had some really good success in the working groups we've had. I think trying to make a larger number of them is going to make our coordination and everything more difficult. Can I ask my other question, though, that I had held back a little while ago?
Please.
This comes back to this larger question. So I've been sitting here kind of like trying to roll around in my head, and I keep coming back to the cart before the horse, right? Or the cart and the horse issue. And I'm trying to figure out which is the cart and which is the horse, right? Because if we look at some of these things, some of them seem to be making the SBOM better, like better used, better at the things it's supposed to do. Another thing is getting SBOMs more numerous, getting them more adopted, right? How do we get more SBOMs out there? And I guess my question for the group is, I think, which one of those do we want to focus on? I don't think you can focus on both, making it better and making it more numerous at the same time. And I think we're going to get a little schizophrenic if we try to do those 2 things. So are we trying to make SBOM more adoptable, or are we trying to make SBOM do more than it can with the current phase? I guess and I don't know if I'm explaining that perfectly well, or if I need to explain it further, but I feel like there's 2 things we're trying to tackle with a list that's all kind of together.
No, I think you're right, which is do we want to focus on making it easier, cheaper, and which is a lot of this, the defining and refining, I think some of that is going to fall in that bucket, right? So we've already established that naming has to be tackled somehow. Then there's, I think you're right, do we want to sort of continue to explore the new stuff as well? Thoughts? And Missy, I'm showing that there's no one in the queue for Q&A. Is that right? We lost Missy too. Les.
So I don't disagree with most everything said.
Can you hear me?
But
yes.
I'm here. Sorry. Yes, there is nobody in queue.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Oh. But I do believe there were a couple of things of whether you want to call it make it better or just was missing in proof of concept 1 and how we did everything this first round that we're going to have to do. And I think that's more of a technical side. That can be a group that works on technical. I think some of these go with that, tooling, naming, things like that. But I do think we need to work a lot on this adoption piece, and that is a process and a PR and who and what are we going to do here, because we're getting in the weeds if we're not careful. A lot of us know each other, and a lot of us get into the weeds where we start getting right down to the minute details, and we want to fix this thing and that thing and this thing and that thing, but it's going to have some problems because it's our first iteration, just like our first time you build a car, but we're going to iterate on that.
Okay. 1, 2, 3.
Zach Hornberger, Medical Imaging Technology Alliance. I think I'm understanding the question to be almost to try to simplify, is what we have now enough to spur adoption, or is what we have now not enough to doggedly pursue widespread adoption? And if it's not, what do we need to do to make it so? Because I think that there are parts of both there. And I think the answer to those two questions might help us focus on what the priorities really need to be coming out of this first phase.
Okay. We're missing one or two things, right? That for the car to run.
Michelle, do you like that framing, boiling it down to sort of a decision point? Mike, and then Doug.
So it sounds like we have a lot of technical folks in the room. Maybe is an SBOM technically vetted out? Does it answer all the things it technically needs to do? Is one answer. And then there's a marketing answer, and I don't see a lot of marketing people in the room, but that sounds like something to be given to marketing. And maybe that's two different skill sets.
Yeah, I think that's something that Josh brought up. The caution I have is marketing people in InfoSec will say our solution works no matter what. So it's always be got to kill. I've got Duncan and then Josh and then Art.
So I guess I do disagree. I think we can do both. I'm more into the incremental, iterative approach that we're on the first cycle through. This was the minimum viable product in both categories. We need to do better in both, and we got to iterate through. We got however much resources we got. But I do not think we should switch it to be serial and say, don't do any awareness adoption until we fix these three nits that we haven't figured out on this side. Conversely, I don't think we should go push what we got as the solution for all people for all times, because there are some issues we got to resolve. So I do think we got to do work on both, and it is just a matter of who contributes. Any given person might not be able to work on everything, but collectively across the community, particularly if we do stress on awareness and adoption and start widening the community, I think we can do both. Over.
Good point. I'm going to go to Josh, and then Art, and then back. Josh.
So, we wrote about this many times in our updates at these public meetings. I had a trio, just want to remind people of that trio, which is the phases would be, let's harmonize the available data points we have from various SCA tools and other things, which was the minimum viable inventory. Let's, second, increase the adoption of the available stuff. And then third, in the subsequent phase, which we're pivoting into, is extensions to support more business cases. So we're not inventing whole cloth. We never were. Almost every single tool has some of these fields, if not all of these fields, and they can be acted upon to support a subset of our use cases. And just like you're going to have 3G wireless and then 4G wireless and then 5G wireless, like we can have subsequent revisions that support and unlock and unleash more things. But there's plenty to both A, harmonize, and B, adopt now while we C, do the higher assurance, more advanced use cases.
I've got Art, and then 2, and then 3.
So just to answer Zach's question, or my answer, I think I don't think the current thing we've designed here is good enough yet. It hasn't been tested enough, I think is my answer. So I would argue that at least we need to keep working on that. Whether or not we also work on adoption at the same time is open question, also possible, debatable, but I think the thing we've built isn't good enough yet. Now, to Josh's point and some others, like there are pockets that work in the world. They're already doing this, so that's also true, but the thing we've built I don't think has been tested and needs some of that first.
Art, I'm going to come back to you to say, other than testing, what are the gaps? But I want to continue to pull this thread. Yeah.
Steve Vu here with Sutter Health. Just to kind of elaborate on that a little bit and to go with the analogy of the car, have we talked about what's the final product is going to look like? Is the car going to be red, 0 to 60 in 3 seconds? Who's going to be maintaining the car, the engine, the oil? Have we looked at what's the final product's going to look like, and then see where we currently at, and then see how we can get to the final product?
I think that's part of the challenge. Is the final product has many visions, and is the minimum viable good enough to get us most of the way there? Before we sort of talk about the bike shed. Sean.
Chris. Chris with Synopsys. I just want to, all these discussions I think have been really interesting. And, I want to point out, from a Synopsys perspective, we address two things, right? We look at binary analysis because we don't have source code, and we look at source code analysis because we have source code and we can do something with that. But I have to tell you, one of the challenges that we face on a regular basis is educating the customer on what is the software bill of materials, because that's not what they use it for. It's very rarely that they're using our tools for software bill of materials. It's a verification and validation of what the vendor has told them, or ensuring that software bill has gone as expected. Those tend to be the key criteria. So, this education program, I think, has to start now. It's one of those things that if you don't start enforcing that, go through iterations and see what the community is going to take and what they won't take, you'll be in the same place in 6 to 8 months.
And this came up a lot this morning of demand-driven, the need to sort of prime that pump. Michelle, then Les.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to follow up on that. I think that there's also a value in the fact that driving some of that awareness and education may also bring valuable feedback that's helpful to feedback into the process as it's going, right? Thinking about what I said that you can't do both at the time, I guess also replying to your comment, I think you're right, we can do them both at the same time, and thinking about that, the more people try it, and the more we can engage people who are using it beyond the proof of concept, which I think brought some really valuable feedback, I think those things will help us make it better. I think in my mind, I would like to see this list separated out a little bit according to those big high-level goals versus the categories of action. I guess it'd be helpful for me to see strategic, goal-oriented groups versus activity-oriented groups.
And that's right. We started with goals. All of those are goals themselves, and the trick was to try to bucket them in a way that might be productive. Very happy to revisit that, but we are now getting to the point where I'm going to continue to push you to say, how are we going to organize ourselves? We have a default path, which we can extend and revise and do all that stuff. If we're going to do something different, rather than take some of these and shoehorn them what we have, we need to sort of establish what that's going to look like. Less than Tim.
Yeah, Les, and apparently I haven't announced myself today. Minimal viable product, I don't disagree with Josh or others for that. My point earlier, and I'll stress it again, is there was at least a couple of items that I know you're going to point at Art to tell you what they are. There are at least a couple of items that we can't make this car run, and we can't sell it to anyone, and it won't get anywhere until we actually do those couple of items, because we went into a roadblock in our proof of concept on a couple of things, and that's why we're on our proof of concept too, so that we can actually socialize this out.
But you don't have those handy.
Well, UIDs, the naming,
it's a number.
there's a couple of things, yeah.
That's good.
Well, they're not all on there, but there was at least two or three of them that we just couldn't get past it because we couldn't agree on both sides. What would that be? You know, I'm gonna put something in here. I mean, I've got all this data in here, but then I've got to point. There's like three elements in that data missing that we can't agree on both sides to pass that along.
My only question was, of the HDOs, have we ever defined what our minimal viable product is from an HDO perspective? I'm just, maybe we have, but.
So I think a lot of what we've seen to date is very useful and actionable. But when it comes down to documenting existing processes, internally developed software and whatnot, and all these beautiful naming conventions, I think a great big long string of characters is wonderful. However, if you really just told me this is the name of the software and this is the revision, like just in plain text, I can work with that. I just need something.
Because I was.
It doesn't have to be we're inventing the wheel and figuring out how to name things all around the world. I would really be happy with just what is the name of the software and what's the current level that it's at and when was the last patch and that kind of stuff.
Because I was wondering, as a group of HDOs, you know, I was thinking about some of the problems that we were having was the SBOM components were coming at us in indiscriminate lumps, and we couldn't hold them all together electronically easily. That was one problem that we really had, is we had this pile of data, but there was nothing that sewed all the data together, because when we get medical devices, a lot of times on the flash and embedded ones, it comes as a lump, and we need to know what that lump is electronically. So I'm wondering if the HDOs, would it be a conceivable idea to have us even just define what our minimal viable product would look like from the perspective of the car?
I think that is, I think that's a phenomenal idea. And right, you've got your use cases already defined. You've got some of the challenges that lump disambiguation can be a priority. That's fun to say for your for the proof of concept work. And again, what we can do, going back to Michelle's point about some better coordination, we can flag that early on. Hey, we don't have a clear way to do this. Let's kick this over to the folks that are not writing technical standards, but are at least speccing it out. And let's also run it by the folks that are thinking about technical standards. They may already have a solution. Michelle.
Okay, I'm not coordinating with my co-chair over there, but, well, maybe I guess we are a little bit. I'm kind of listening to the POC conversation, and one thing I was thinking about is we did the proof of concept in parallel with the framing group activity. And one thing that I would love to know is if you took the framing report and applied it to what you got out of the POC, what would the feedback be, right? Because I think you guys had to go forward with the POC before we had the baseline elements going, right? So, like, I almost feel like we need to pressure test a little bit, group to group, right? And I think framing group could start to maybe tackle something like naming, something like that. And then we could ask the POC to pressure test the framing group report while we're doing those different things and see if there's a way of kind of collaborating those two efforts a little bit.
And I don't see a reason to not go in that direction. I also don't want to spend too much time other than just throwing things over to POC to do.
Yeah, well, I think that goes along with the receivers of the information defining the minimum viable product, and definitely rely on what the framing group has already come up with in defining that.
Josh on the call, and then Duncan.
So we're kind of like the blind men describing an elephant, or the blind people describing an elephant. But at the risk of us talking past each other, we do have cars that can drive. It is true that most of the participants in the healthcare just do it pilot, let it rip, all the great things they're doing, are fairly new to creating and exchanging these. That is absolutely true. It is also true that I have SBOM-ish reports from my customers in the formats of Veracode, in the formats of PDF files, in the formats of Sonotype scans, in the formats of source clear scans, in the formats of Black Duck. In fact, I think Black Duck's been doing this for 20 years, and one of them's in the room. These exist, and they do not look the same. Their order of their columns are not the same, but every single one of them I've gotten for product X has the same Java libraries, the same version numbers, the same MD5 hashes, in a different logo and printout. Sometimes it's a CSV file. But these cars drive. They just don't drive the same way or look the same way.
And I think
that's why I was trying to say let's harmonize the available. And they are actionable, by the way, because when they find something I didn't know about, I can do something about it. So Jim's point in the pilot about a Rosetta Stone or a translator, that's a very important tactical thing for an operator to receive. But it is not the case that they can't be done or there's some future state. So it is true they're not super consistently consumable. It is not true that they haven't been done or can't provide the minimum viable information. And the most near-term, last point, the most near-term definition of what's minimum viable is whatever the FDA does to MDMs, which we pretty much know maps to the framing doc's minimum viable inventory.
So I want to remind you of the conversation you had this morning, where you said, here are a bunch of great ideas. We are not lacking for those. The task that is in front of us now is how are we going to organize to tackle them. We have approached a POC. We have some discussions about some things that we need to whiteboard out. It is possible that those need to be sort of ironed out before we can go full steam ahead, but we can certainly move towards all of the awareness and adoption stuff that you talked about this morning, including business cases from existing side of things, common language, branding, all of this stuff. So I don't want you to feel that you are lost at sea. The question is, how are you going to efficiently move ahead so that we don't have these conversations over and over and over again? All right, I've got Duncan, and then Mike, and then Art.
So 3 points. My second one is directly to the question you just asked. The first one's a setup for it. Just something.
Mike.
So 3 points. First point is related to demos. Something we forgot to mention that we mentioned in previous meetings is a demo that involved more than one layer of supplier. So we had supplier 1 and supplier 2. That was brought up based on Josh's discussion that he just made, is he's a supplier to some of the suppliers that were involved in the healthcare trial. So we might even have a volunteer if we can talk him into it. But my main point is associated with how do we want to organize. It got mentioned before, we probably don't want 14 different groups. We probably only want a few. Somebody mentioned we should organize around goals. So my interpretation of what just got said was there should be, I think, 3 major groups, one of which is the how do we improve what we got from a definition of an SBOM viewpoint, and tooling, and tooling doesn't. Defining and naming and all that stuff goes under that one. The second one is how do we promote awareness and adoption, and then that goes broader and includes business purposes and tooling and everything we can do that's inhibiting stuff from going forward. So it might be a bit too large of a group, but that would be one way. And then the third group's a little bit weird because it'd be the demonstration group, which in the first phases of this was just one demonstration. But one thing we'll have to address if we're going to have 4 or 5 demos is that one demo group or 5 demo groups or one demo group with 5 subgroups. But I think the 3 big groups are how do we improve what we got, how do we get other people to use it, and how do we do proof of concepts.
So 2 quick points. One, I think we did some good discussion about demos at an ad hoc level working with the healthcare proof of concept. As that becomes too unwieldy, we will figure out what that follow-on structure. So that's great. Second point is you put tooling under the awareness and adoption side of things.
Why isn't everybody already doing this?
Good. Thoughts for the Duncan vision?
That was my point. So to Josh's point, yes, you have some cars that are they're driving. There's some out there. Some have been there 20 years. But guess what? They're not highly adopted and they're not widespread. And that is the key that we've been trying to work on in this proof of concept is we've got 2 or 3 things to make this widely accepted, because the questions we get over and over with this is Can we standardize? Is this, can we all work on this? Can we all consume it? Can we all produce it without us all going around and making about, 1,500 different flavors of this thing? When we do that, you're not going to get adoption. It took a long time for cell phones, if you guys remember, to also be adopted. They were here, they were big bricks, they were, and it took a while until it became standardized, and there were those 3 or 4 things that were a roadblock that got everybody to adopt it. So it's my soapbox, but.
So for the demonstration group or the proof of concept group, if we are going to try and go live with the next revision in February, or the kickoff in February, maybe between now and then, can we do a review of the framing group's work and see how it applies in lessons learned?
And the use group too while you're out.
If we're going to do that, can we have someone from those groups sit in and kind of walk us through it?
I know that was Michael's vacation meeting, so.
Well, I was just going to say, I belong to the POC. I have in the past had a constant roadblock to that. I will be on it from here on.
Yeah,
So.
we don't need to do the logistics right now. We are trying to do so excellent. I love having both of those ideas out there. We've got a group to be named soon, but built on the existing framing group that is going to continue to do this. First order might be to start doing the tackling of, other than the lack of stress testing of minimum viable, what are these obstacles, and sort of diving in there. That's also, I think, good to engage with the POC folks to get their experience of what was missing, things like that. The next question, Charlie, go ahead.
Just real quick to finish up on that. I don't know that adoption is going to be our challenge here to some degree. I think we've got a lot of interest from a lot of different areas. We could end up with more adoption than we are able to process.
But let's talk about what we've currently put under this. That is I love that. It's inevitable. We can all get to the bar now.
That wasn't exactly my point, but yeah.
So, I do, Charlie, I do agree with your optimism that this is now something that folks, if they tried to stop this now, would not be able to. It is such a good idea, and it is not that impossible. But that doesn't mean that there's still not a lot of work to do. What we currently have is we've got obstacles, we've got POC, and inside the broader penumbra of promotion, because I think you're right, awareness and adoption. Promotion, we want to make it easier, cheaper, more attractive, etc. We've got tooling, business process discussion from this morning, and then some of the high-level awareness and adoption stuff, which includes messaging, coordination, information management, and things like that. That's a lot for one group. Happy to work with the folks around that group to sort of set that up and get the ball rolling. We can have subgroups. Subgroups are very productive, but they also add complexity. So, for example, I'm going to call Kate out. Kate has a great vision, which is we're just going to set up a bloody GitHub page and start listing tools. That's really important. Probably doesn't require, the people who aren't very familiar with the tools for the first pass definitely want to have more engagement as you've developed that. So do you like this sort of capturing those 3 buckets and those goals in a group, in which case, let's start talking about prioritizing what the work would do? Or do we want to say, maybe we can do a little segmentation if we think there are different communities of interest?
I think how you, I'll raise my hand, is that okay?
Yes, sorry, I was glancing at the phone.
I think how you phrased it with 3 different groups. I mean, we can start that way. If it doesn't work, we splinter more, right? It's hard to get people together. It's easier to split them up. I do know, and maybe this is what you're going to talk about when you say prioritizing, but to Josh's point as well is there will be a bunch of different SBOMs created once the FDA decides to come out a draft, right? And so we need to time our stuff so we've got something that will be usable.
No, it's a great point. Right? It's easy to forget there are folks that are.
I would almost say be more proactive in that provide an example of what this should look like to the FDA for acceptance. We've seen a lot of success with that in the past.
Afton is not here, but I'm going to guess that that's actually something that the team would appreciate because that means they don't have to do it. So, and coincidentally, I've got Josh on the line, so maybe he has some further thoughts on that as well as the organization.
Yeah, just quick reminder that's been said to many of us before, the SCA tools, of which I think I pay almost all of them in one way, shape, or form through some acquisition, they're all willing and able to spit out the data they already have in all of the above formats. SWID, SPDX, comma-separated file, Cyclone DX, even though some people hate that idea. It's not hard for them. They said once you guys determine what you want, it would be 1 to 2 weeks before they could spit out plural formats. So I'm not saying all things are easy, but the presentation layer of information they already have to harmonize to whatever FDA wants is not a heavy lift for them. I don't think any of them, including the one in the room, Synopsys, has ever claimed it would be difficult to spit out information they have. What's difficult is if it's asking for information they don't have, and not once, including on Friday with FDA in person, have I heard anyone say they want more information than these tools already have.
Great, thank you. Opinions on the putting under the rubric of awareness and adoption the business process discussion, the tooling discussion, as well as documenting business cases, language, branding, and outreach and information collection? Josh, that was to you since I had you on the line, but they've cut your mic already. Okay, I had a hand somewhere. Duncan.
Well, I was saying I don't have any problem with giving guidance to the FDA of existing proof. I do have a problem if we outrun our headlights and think we're picking a particular answer already. I mean, the state that we're at the moment is there are multiple formats. They're all approximately equal. We can argue nits and lice on any of them, but that we're not picking one. If to solve the FDA issue we have to pick one, that's a problem in its own right that we better make an issue. I don't think we need to go that far.
I believe there is some boilerplate about the government not picking winners and losers that I would introduce here. But I think that's the power of the great work that Kate and Dave Waltermeyer did. Actually, it was about a year ago. I remember being on the phone in shopping for Thanksgiving stuff while we were talking through some of that stuff. So we have sort of the core fields, and that's one of the tasks in front of us is, hey, what's wrong with calling this not just is the minimum viable actually viable, I guess is another word. Art.
So on that narrow topic, I'm a proponent of, proposing something to the FDA that they might like and accept, certainly. But do we know what they want? So if we give them core baseline and they can inventory the stuff in the medical device, great. Is that why why are they asking for this inventory in the first place? And do maybe the HDO people know already, or the vendors know?
Given that Afton has stepped out, are you guys okay with tabling this particular, the FDA side of it for a moment?
It should be answered, or else we can't go. Yeah.
Okay. But there's still, right, other sides of the minimum viable for the folks outside, right? There are other parts of healthcare that the FDA doesn't regulate.
Just going back 1 second, to be super clear, I'm going to propose that the framing group, or whatever the name we become, we are more or less, post further discussion with the group, willing to take on identity or naming, or coordinate that at least, and be responsible for it. Also, we'd be happy to work with the healthcare pilot to see if what we came up with at the same time you guys were running your pilot, if you were to take the pilot and virtually run it back through, would that make any sense? Would things work or not? We were very happy to sit down and do that as a joint effort. I think that's very important, in fact. Otherwise, our stuff is just theoretical paper. So, yeah.
And the final thing I may slot onto your agenda just because is distribution of SBOMs to at least start that conversation. Right, that is a big issue, but something that already came up in the healthcare group, and again, could look like here are the 6.5 ways you can do it, and try to sort of start from there. Duncan.
So does that mean they're not doing expanding beyond included?
No, we're not closing things off. We're prioritizing.
Yeah, only up to 3 so far, I think.
Well,
On framing.
I think you need that to continue.
So this is we're getting things underway, and the important thing is the style of work is going to be revolving around the specification, focusing on the minimum viable, and then seeing what other extensions are needed. We're going to leave them open to that expanding. So I want to return to this third group, which is the thing that is not refining and potentially expanding the model, and is not demonstrations, but it is the remainder of the things up there. That's a lot of ground to cover. And so, again, a single group, I think, could do it. Probably will want some subgroups. Probably will want some where it would be, coming apart, coming together, or the meeting will be more, let's get updates from different task groups. I think there's a lot of value to have it in the same conversation, but on the other hand, that's a lot of work to do for one group to do.
I think it's a lot of work to do. There's no question about that. I think, though, if we get caught up on how we can break up those topics into 2 separate groups, we will have a lot of talking without a lot of progress.
Good. Okay. Going to revisit the phones. If anyone has an opinion, check this. So essentially, we have tooling gaps. On the process side, we want to sort of document what processes already have. That includes, what's already there, as well as saying, hey, what are some playbooks for different use cases? Which means we've got to talk about use cases. And then there is all of the information management that goes along with coordination for all the different efforts. And then finally, we want some of the engagement side. So that's targeted sector engagement, branding, things like that.
So just to clarify, those are the leftovers you're talking about?
So yes, it is the entire right side of the screen and tooling. So it is all of this. And again, we said this when we were coming up with goals. We wouldn't be able to do all of them immediately. And this. Now, we can start thinking about breaking that down to subgroups. So for example, information management on other things is going to be front heavy to figure out what the process will be for organizing our information and making sure it doesn't get stale. And then after that, just needs people to pound the pavement, have these regular meetings, people shout things out. As soon as someone says something, you say, wait, let me put it in the appropriate way. Other things are going to require, a lot more work, especially if we don't want just to have the people write them, but have people give critical feedback on them, like the playbooks. The tooling collection, short term seems straightforward. The tooling gap analysis starts to require a lot more different perspectives as well. Michelle.
Yeah, I question whether tooling belongs with those other 2 groups. I guess
on the other side of the screen.
No, but did I understand you correctly saying that you want one group to cover business process awareness and tooling?
That was the tentative.
Okay.
That was the tentative hypothesis.
Yeah. Just thinking about the skills of the people that would be involved in those 2 things, I feel like tooling might be maybe segregated a little bit, or a subset of that, than the other 2. But that's just, it also depends on how you're defining tooling and what you're putting in that mental model of that.
Sorry? 2 groups. Sorry. But there were in fact 4 groups, and yes, but Kate has a response to that.
I think if we're going to be, basically building up processes, they need to be processes based on tools so the adoption actually happens. And so I can see an argument for all of them basically being pulled together so that as tools are there and use cases are there, they're done in the context of the tools that are there, and we can actually build up to something useful. Otherwise, it's going to be, I'm worried it won't be as productive as we'd like it to be.
In which case? If we're all together, if they're sort of
if it's separated out, I think the business processes, use cases, like I say, first thing in business processes is document existing processes. Yeah. First thing sitting in tooling is documenting processes. I think there's a crying need to pull it together.
Jim?
I'm going to contradict myself.
Contain multitudes.
When I said we could spend a lot of time talking about how to divvy up the big monster group, we could split it up into inside work and outside work. So the tooling, some of the process work is things we need to determine internally. The awareness and adoption, the playbooks, that's outward focused. Common language.
More about the inside and outside of what?
Inside NTIA cross stakeholder.
So are we thinking like within a company versus between companies? Or
Things we're building versus things we're looking at.
Okay.
Things we need to determine internally and things that are targeting groups outside this effort.
It's true, although just to push back on that
just
a little bit, I think collecting tooling is also going to involve doing some outer engagement. It's going to be more than just the things that are in Kate's head.
It's not in just my head. There's actually a lot of stuff going on in Europe.
So,
Charlie.
sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think if you look at the work that the formats group has done versus the work that the practices group has done, there are sort of two distinct buckets there that stuff sort of falls into fairly neatly, I think, my opinion only. The tooling part and the harmonization, I don't know, maybe that's probably the major two pieces sort of on a formats group, I think, because they know about standards. The skill set is, the group is well stocked with standards people and open source people, whereas the practices group has been already doing sort of the whys and the publicity, awareness, trying to get people on board, that kind of thing. So there's, in my view, there are two separate things, and the break would be fairly clean between them.
The skill set, and again, in that case, we would still want to do what was flagged by Kate and Michelle, which is make sure that no one gets ahead of other people, especially.
Correct.
So prioritizing things in such a way that we've got a proper Gantt chart.
Right. And then I don't think it's just one other thing. I don't think if you give everything to the practices group, it's going to get through a quarter of it. You know what I mean? It's just going to be too mind-boggling.
So I'm going to propose that I have no vested interest in it. I'm happy to have it be more. I should propose it based on somebody said we should do it by the goals, and I saw the goals were we had hindrance to adoption and improving the stuff we already had. So by the hindrance to adoption, tooling fell under that bucket. But if it's a different group of people and it goes to the other group, don't just because I proposed it, I could care less how it's divvied up.
I think there's the intellectual separation, but I'm encouraging you now to think about the work being done. And Charlie's point is, hey, the folks in the standards group have been sort of thinking about tooling from the get-go, so it makes sense. And the folks in the practice group, have an easier to remember name that won't change all the time if it's. Thoughts on that? Chris, different thought. All right, I want to, we sort of have two general ideas. I am going to express a personal opinion. I try to avoid sharing those. I think having 4 groups will help the work get done a little faster, especially if we can sort of commit to doing some of the cross-coordination. And Art said something about, kicking NTIA until they do it better, and you should all feel free to chime in on kicking NTIA until they do it better.
So I fully support the 4 groups, which are the first bullet, the second bullet, the third bullet, and the second column.
Still a lot of work. Yeah, you do it. So basically, we forked out business processes as a separate discussion this morning, and the proposal is to fold that back into the awareness and adoption discussion with a particular eye on making sure that if there are things that are going to be building on tooling, that those not be the first thing that that group tackles, so that the tooling group can sort of lead and that group can follow. That way we're capturing the dependency issue. Yes?
Is there any reason not to have the 4 groups as indicated, and in, let's just say the business process group is one group, that they can't have subgroups that focus and then drill back up?
Nope. We can organize things the way they want, the way you want. The challenge is sort of thinking through how that will work. Subgroups often, the goal of groups is to try to create as much orthogonality as possible so that we don't step on each other's toes, and also folks who have particular interests don't have to spend their entire week on the phone on these working group calls. And so that's one of the goals of trying to organize. Subgroups could make things more efficient, or they could, in fact, say now that you've turned one group into 3 weekly phone calls instead of 1 weekly phone call. 1, 2, 3.
So my suggestion is for the 4th group, because they've done, say the use cases group, can try to do as their next phase work as adoption of those use cases and validation of those use cases into a community, and come back and rewrite the use cases. So instead of that whole right column can be one group, but they do it in phases. I'm saying the first phase, because in the past they've already written some use cases, right? Now take those use cases and try to see adoption across some industries to find out what use cases did we miss, what use cases are resonating more and more, and come back and rewrite it.
And do you have a specific intuition when you say use case? Do you mean
the one group
volume management versus licensing? Do you mean this sector versus that sector, or this role? Do you have particular ways of organizing that in mind, or that's something the group will also figure out?
Yeah, that's a detail that group can figure out, but the group basically works on phases. The first phase is really taking this to start evangelizing, start getting feedback, and then come back and rewrite it.
Okay. Yeah, I like that. Also, don't want you all to forget the importance of the broader engagement and harmonization piece as well.
Yes. So that's exactly what I was going to say. It's the broader engagement harmonization thing is not like those other things. Right? And that might be better off in the formats and standards folks, because they're already doing it.
Not sure I agree. I think that's different, but I don't think those two should be broken up into 2 different groups. I think it is one. I think it should be up to that group to how they want to internally organize, given whatever they want to focus on. I do think that group needs to issues that were brought up earlier. I think all the groups need to coordinate better than we did in the first round. But in the bigger case of the second column, I think we need to work with the tooling group that we don't get ahead of them and they don't get ahead of us, so we coordinate there. I think we need to work with the demonstration, multiple subgroups doing all the different demos, because if we do get into playbooks and use case specific, we got real life cases to deal with. We might as well learn from them.
And so I'm hearing the awareness and adoption has 2 key perspectives. One is sort of examination and study, and the other is sort of broadcast. And some of that early broadcast can happen with what you guys have already talked about, like your FAQs, things like that. You can start on that now. And others, as you all have pointed out, should wait just a little longer before we get some of the insight from both studying what we already have as well as getting input from the other groups. All right. We spent a while. We took the long route. We got to 4 basic groups with some tasks. We can walk through what we'd like to do differently this time from a higher level perspective. We've talked about the importance of doing cross-group coordination. One thing that I've heard is when we have a community meeting and we want feedback on things, we need to actually give folks some time to give feedback, right? If the power comes from the criticism and the constructive engagement, we need to make sure there's some time to do that. Other notes from an organizational perspective, from a tactical perspective that you'd like to share? Duncan.
So at the conclusion of this meeting, the 4 existing groups become the 4 new groups, and a meeting schedule gets set up, and they have chairs and all that sort of stuff. Is that what you're saying? I'm not following exactly what the details are.
Great point. We're going to loop back into that front for next steps. But yes, we will have 4 new charters. In terms of leadership, I think it makes sense to have at least one of the people stay from each of them. But again, that's up to people's time and availability. Again, at the beginning, the task is heavy on the organization and getting all the ideas prioritized and things like that. The first step is going to be for each of those groups to say, here's our general mission, and here's going to be how we're going to, our short-term goals, and here's going to be how we're going to organize ourselves to get those done. Thoughts or challenges around that? Josh mentioned something this morning, and Michael, I see you on the phone, that I think would be really useful, which is everyone probably has 1 or 2 people in their world that aren't exactly in their same identical role, but that they say, this person should be involved in this discussion, either because they have a really valuable perspective or because you don't like them very much and you want them to be subject to it. This is a valuable and rewarding work, and thank you all for taking your time. Shouldn't joke like that. But it is something that we're going to work hard to try to promote more people to engage moving forward. And so we'll spend a few minutes in a moment just sort of trying to sketch out a few more details about each of these working groups as we see them now, so that we can engage in that kind of outreach. But I did want to sort of pause and give a moment to breathe and also say, what more do you want from NTIA or from each working group to make them work better? You guys were pretty involved in a lot of the stuff that happened. Matt, and then we'll go to Michael on the phone.
Yeah, Matthew Eggers here. I'm with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Thanks for doing this, Alan. We've been very interested in the evolution of the SBOM discussion from a kind of a technical and probably more so a business and policy standpoint. Well, I've been listening all day. One of the things I'm trying to still figure out is how do we sell members on this issue? I'm not exactly clear. You guys are very technically inclined. But for folks that aren't technically inclined, including myself, I'm still wondering, how do we sell this to companies that would provide the SBOM, and forgive me if I get things wrong, or companies that would want to buy in and use an SBOM? I think I get it, but I don't understand how we push this out and make this something where businesses benefit by selling it and businesses benefit by buying it. The one thing I worry about in this space is not so much the technical work, it's what do policymakers want to do by leveraging this work to make it more mandatory. That's why I'm really here. Hopefully everybody kind of uses this and we go off on our way, and it's very valuable from a security standpoint. I get it. But the marketing piece, I think, is going to need a lot of work because I struggle to figure out how this is going to be used. And I'm generally in this space. And for folks that aren't in this space, I think it's going to be a real challenge. So I just say that I'm interested in the work. I don't know how to sell it, but I'm eager to learn more.
We've got a little change my mind meme here going on. I've got Mike, Brendan, Duncan, and then we'll go back. Relatively quick responses, and I want to get Michael on the phone.
So I want one, and the reason I want one is I have 35,000 medical devices that I'm responsible for, and I don't do software very much at all. I'm not a cybersecurity specialist. And I get a notification that Blue Keep is out, or Urgent 11 is out, or Virus of the Week is out, and I have 100 different people calling me on the phone in the course of 2 hours and saying, hey, does this apply to us? What are you going to do about it and when? How many patients can we not treat? And they want an answer to all those questions when I just found out we've got something when the first one of them called me because I was having coffee with a colleague. So if I have all of this information in my database, and I've got a database of all my devices and their characteristics, if I have this information fed in via the network, fed in the machine language fed in, so I don't have to individually go type all this information in, hire somebody, create a job to be a data entry person. If it just automatically feeds in, then when they ask me that question, I can push a button. And I can say, how many devices have remote desktop enabled? And I can get a short list, and I can say these 22 things are the issue. These 22 things we may have to consider if we're going to kill a patient. So let's take these 22 offline and figure it out, and the rest of it we can go. So that's why I want this, and I suspect there are countless other organizations just like mine who want the exact same thing for the exact same reason. Now, why should anybody make it and sell it to me or give it to me for free? That's a different conversation.
Sure, use your mic.
Thank you. A quick follow-up. You're in the healthcare space. How do you guys think about this in terms of the cost that you have to expend to utilize such a tool? Let me start there. Cost.
So the cost of, if I can.
Yeah, please.
The cost of having to do all this currently, manually, with an FTE is already there. This is just a product that's going to automate that and make my labor dollars go down. This is actually going to reduce costs and not drive them up. It's going to allow me to do that on the procurement side when I look at what I'm buying in the first place, so I don't let manufacturers deliver machines with Windows 7 on them when it's going to expire in a month. And it's going to allow me to also look at life cycle management. When I go, hey, I think this machine runs and makes a pretty picture. Can I keep using it to treat patients? It's certified and accredited. Well, the problem with that is it's got these 14 vulnerabilities that we've mitigated. Maybe instead of replacing this thing that works, we should look at this other thing that works because this one has more cyber vulnerabilities. So it allows me life cycle management-wise to prioritize my spend, which saves me money.
I was just going to say, I see Alan's looking at his watch, but I understand much of this. I was just wanting to have folks kind of articulate it a little bit. Please, and then, Alan, I don't want to get you off track.
Quickly.
Well, I was going to say the fact you asked that question proves why we need the second column. That's our point. We have not done our job at advocating this. So the question's a very good question because if everybody already did this, we wouldn't have needed this group. All right. So we definitely have an issue with that. But I would argue the practices document does have in it, it saves money on the user side. It also saves money on the producer side. Both sides should do it for a pure business cost reason, and that's what we get it better at articulating. It's
Alan,
cheaper for the manufacturer. It's cheaper for the user. It's a no-brainer if we can explain it right.
Alan, one last question. What percentage of the marketplace is using SBOMI-like stuff now?
For interesting, so for
for hardware, 100%. Yes.
So I want to point to Kate and Brendan to quickly jump in. Oh, Brendan?
42%.
Yeah.
So exactly in your question. So in the last year, we sent 27 million vulnerability alerts due to dependent software. Something like 85% of all open source is hosted on GitHub, and pretty much 100% of all software uses open source components at this point. We want to participate in the SBOM process because we want to take, exactly as the previous comment was saying, we want this to not be a manual thing where we try to protect the downstream customers who are going to have their businesses destroyed, going to have their livelihoods destroyed. We want it to be an automated process of remediation. So we want to provide this because we already have the data and we just need to be able to tell people. This doesn't impose any additional costs on us. We already built the system. We already know every dependency of every software component built on GitHub. We do that as a service so we can notify the direct developers of it.
The other thing that I think is important that the use cases document that characterizes the roles and benefits is you get the benefits when a lot of people do this. This is one of those. So some of the benefits will accrue to particular vendors, but to really get these amazing powers of scale and economics does require different parts of the supply chain to all be on board, and that's why. All right, we got Tim, and then we'll drag Matt out with us after this so we can all sort of surround him and not let him leave until he is a convert.
We've been asking our vendors for SBOMs for 3 or 4 years now, and only a few of them are even successful to provide them at this point. So this effort right here hopes to move that bar further, faster, so that when we're asking for a software bill of materials, we don't get back the disclaimer that this is a, what do they call that? A trade secret. Intellectual property. It's trade secret. We can't tell you any of this. We want to get rid of that.
We've got Art chiming in. Yes.
At least one regulator is going to be requiring it. There's a why for you. You sort of have to. So FDA is asking for it, or you're going to mandate it for the medical device community. Other regulatory safety sectors may follow suit.
Yeah, so along with that, I mean, if you look at any of the major standards out right now, 21434 for automotive, 62443 for industrial control systems, all of them are requiring software bill of materials. They're not necessarily describing what should be included in that, but from a industry perspective, this is, of all of our product lines, this is the only product that has had triple-digit growth for the last 3 years and is anticipated to continue for the next 3 to 5 years. Okay. The demand is ridiculous.
And I would like to, it is enthusiastic, it is great to see the entire room full of people are able to rise for the challenge. Since I assume that, with the exception of Matt, everyone is here because they're part of this vision they believe in. So I'm going to encourage us to focus on how do we get closer to that vision. And I like Duncan's point that, the fact that, Matt's heard some briefings on this before and still wanted that case made clearly and succinctly shows that there's some work that we can do and help guide our vision. So one of the things I want to do while we still have time is first we're going to talk about the next steps for the broader group, and then we're going to use the remainder of our time to talk a little bit about how these groups can get more focused and targeted in terms of priorities. And in particular, I think we'll start with thinking through the tooling side and then the awareness and adoption side. So first, let's talk about next steps. Right? The challenge of doing things in December is apparently people enjoy their social lives and their loved ones. And the government has learned to accept that fact. So we acknowledge that things, even as we stand up these working groups, hopefully starting Thursday and Friday, we're still going to have some interruptions at the holidays. That's fine. We also understand that most of you, when possible, like to avoid getting on planes without having a vacation on the other end. And so we want to try to continue the habit of having every other meeting be a virtual meeting. And so the vision is for us to next reconvene as a community and check in with each other in late January or early February in a virtual meeting. So we'll do a web share. It will be probably midday Eastern time, which gets the tail end of Europe, early California, and yet again screws up for our friends in Japan. I'm sorry, guys. So we want to do some deconflict on dates for that. And then probably about 8 weeks after that, convene for an in-person meeting, either here in Washington, or if you have a better place for us to go, we can talk about that. So that's the broad plan. Reactions to that rough timeline. Duncan.
That's a bunch of meetings. What do we want the output of the groups to be in what time frame?
Great question. So we talked about saying the first step for these meeting groups is going to be to sort of, define themselves. So hopefully with some of the discussion today, we'll be able to sort of say, here's a high-level description of these groups. Each group will define a charter, have short-term set of goals, and ideally some medium-term goals as well, and a plan of how they're going to do that. And I think asking for that by January seems feasible. I know that some of you will actually be able to have some work underway by then, but that seems like the high-level approach. Each group is going to set their own timetable. It's my job to hold them to that and to encourage them to do so aggressively. Right? The pattern of group work doesn't change. It takes us a little while of going around in a circle. It doesn't feel very efficient. And then we just say, fine, we've talked about this enough. Someone goes off and does it, and then we have to review it, comment it, edit it, critique it, etc. Anyone think that is a terrible idea and we can do things much more efficiently? We just stop listening to Alan. Yeah. Duncan.
So I do agree with how we sort of structured into 4 groups like we had before. Last time we had 4 deliverables for the 4 groups. I think this time we might shoot for a more agile, more often smaller sets of deliverables, like naming could have a different deliverable than cloud SAS, than expanding beyond included, as opposed to just version 2 of the document that's there, at least as a possibility, because I think, at least in my mind, a lot of the progress got made once somebody did actually put black on white and then everyone else could throw red on it. Because the real value, it's way easy. I will confess I'm horrible at writing, but I'm great at marking up other people's documents. It's easier to just to get the actual, we were actually in much more sync than I would have thought from some of our discussions. Right. But once we got the black on white, it's, oh, no, if you word it that way, I'm okay. And so if we could start thinking on the next round at getting those out in smaller chunks sooner, or they might still be serial. They might only focus on one thing first.
I think that makes sense. And I also want to, I see the folks, we've got some folks on the phone to sort of talk about the sort of bigger picture side of things. Very much agree. Also open to the idea of using things other than PDFs. I know from the folks dealing with code, they're like, no, we deal in code. We want GitHub or other ways of sort of thinking about this. So we want to make sure we can have that big tent approach. And now that we have nti.gov/SBOM, we have a place for documents that have been, again, vetted by the community. We don't want, one author with a few people commenting to then be able to say this now speaks for the entire community. But we can take advantage of processes to make sure that process moves faster. I do want to go to the phone. I've got Josh and then Michael and then Claude, but I may interstitial a few from the room. So let's go to Josh first, then Michael.
All right, I've been in the queue for a while, but I'll honor the spirit of your new section, which is the in-person meeting. Do you have tentative dates? Because I think too close to Thanksgiving is very bad, and too close to Christmas is very bad. I'd like to nominate something like the 11th or 12th, but if while I'm unmuted, even though it's a small time warp back, one of the things for those who haven't been here to all the meetings, so this is directed at you, Matt Eggers.
So I do want to focus on the productive side. So we will. I'm sorry to cut you off, Josh, but I do want to focus on the work moving forward.
I think it is, but okay.
Okay, good. No, then go for it.
I'd love to build on your point, and I think some of the use cases in the use case document, I was muted before, do make some good business cases for volunteer. Remember, this is a volunteer practice. There are a couple regulators that are requiring it, but also the bigger argument I've made to some of the confusion folks in the past that we could build on with your help is that rather than having FDA accidentally make a standard that less fitting technologies or SaaS providers would have to be forced into, this was getting in front of it with more voices to have something that is least disruptive and most beneficial for all. So if we start with what we have, we could pivot to bolstering and filling in the blanks to make a stronger case together.
Thank you. I like that. Michael, sorry for the wait.
I just sent you a email with an outline in it of a short document, which, after listening to our chamber colleague speak, rang the bell. I was already planning on this intervention, but he really put an exclamation point on it for me. I think at this stage, an interim strategy document that captures both where this effort has been to date and where it's heading with this reconfiguration of the working groups and levels of effort passed forward in a very classic form. I'm sure you've seen a million of them. Strategy, vision, mission, goals, levels of effort, working groups. Maybe attach some minutes from today. Maybe attach the reports delivered last week as well, so that there's a common messaging out there in addition to a common vision of the path forward.
Thank you. No, that's great, and certainly it's something that internally we're going to work on making sure we can communicate what happened today outward, and of course the challenge there is different audiences are going to care about different things, and I like your framing. Thank you. So there was a question about dates. We're going to be playing with those as we go. If we think end of January, early February, and then end of March, early April. I am guessing that it is, absolutely impossible to find something that will work for everyone, especially those of us who are in travel-heavy environments. But I think we should be able to find sometimes there. What are things that I should know about the last week of January and the first week of March? Shmooka, it's the weekend. FOSDEM?
FOSDEM. Avoid FOSDEM.
Okay. So, but it is good that they are weekends. That's good. Anything else?
No, there's a lot of shoulder events the week before.
Sure. And this will be a virtual event, but I'll find the weekend, the block of FOSDEM.
So I thought that was in person.
Sorry, this is the virtual, yes. This is the late January, early February is going to be virtual.
Only virtual. Okay.
That's going to be our next meeting because the holidays are going to interfere with some of the work.
It may only be me, unless I can talk more people of you into attending, but that DoD Plug Fest is the 27th and 28th of January up at Dreamport.
So that first week of February, I think, is a good week. We also discussed this in our proof of concept because that's when we want to officially kick off our next one. It was February 3rd, February 4th in that meeting for POC2.
All right. And just very, very quickly, preferences that you guys have from this sort of virtual meeting. If we do 3-hour call, 3.5-hour call, we usually time it to be 12 to 3 or 4-ish. Try to avoid Monday and Friday. Other than that, any preferences you guys have? Anything that we should think about that you guys want us to know about? Time budget bio breaks for that's a good point. On the long calls, those get long. Thank you. We'll just make sure on the phone. Sorry, Claude, I see you. I will come back to you in just a moment, Claude. Thank you for your patience. Then the last week of March, or first week of April. The goal is we can try to get far enough out that while there will be more important things, you'll have committed to this one first. What's that? Okay.
Again, it may only be me, but Study Group 17, ITU Study Group 17 runs through the 26th of March. So.
Okay. All right. We will also, oh, sorry, yes.
No, I was just going to put a vote in for the first week of April.
Okay. We will follow up with some tentative dates to allow uproar to wash over us. This is going to give us sort of a chance to move forward. I want to spend the last few minutes that we have sort of walking through goals and priorities for the two groups that have sort of the larger things on their agenda. But before we do, I have left Claude sitting on hold for quite some time, and I apologize for that. Monsieur Baudouin. Oops, hang on a second. Amanda, when you have a chance, can we get Claude's line open? Hey, Claude.
Hey, can you hear me now?
We can indeed.
Okay, I'm sounding like a Verizon commercial, I know. My comment was about the schedule of that March/April meeting. I just wanted to let you know that Object Management Group is meeting the week of March 23rd in Reston. So it's both an opportunity and a challenge, but I heard that someone else had a conflict around those same days, and you're pushing off to the next week. I'm not the authority on what's going to happen in terms of an SBOM specification submission at OMG that week. We'd have to ask Bob Martin of MITRE, who's very involved in that, and he may or may not be on the call. But there might be some fresh news on progress at OMG during that week, and some of the people who might be traveling to Reston for that meeting might be able to stay over and participate in
Thank you.
in your meeting the following week. So
thank you.
We can coordinate offline, but be aware of that.
Thank you. Very helpful, and also something that we want to explore of making sure that this community is aware of that effort and understands what they're trying to do. And also on the phone, we have Cassie.
Hello.
Hi, Cassie.
Hi, from Schneider Electric. One question, just how are we organizing the leadership and for new people that want to join a specific working group? How does that happen? Because I'm assuming you want to organize those groups in the next 2 weeks, and we have the Thanksgiving holiday and such.
Those are fantastic questions. Thank you for flagging those. We do want to do quite a bit of promotion around getting folks to join those. We have handy mailing lists already. 3 are thanks to our friends at CertCC, and 1 is thanks to the good offices at the Linux Foundation. Thank you for those electrons. And we can keep those unless folks feel that they need a brand new name for keep the mailing list. You can always just change the text, the naming. On the leadership front, I was going to reach out to the folks that have been sort of the coordinators to sort of talk more directly about were they up for that, and then can we, if it's useful, to sort of think about bringing some new folks in. Do you have an opinion on that, Cassie?
I would like to be involved in the awareness and the business process side, wherever that ended up located, because, again, from especially an ICS perspective, I want to make sure that we can give the voice to that sector.
Excellent. And I think that's going to be built on the practices working group. And yes, it's something that we will want to sort of think through what that leadership looks like. There was someone here who sort of stepped in over the last few months to sort of keep that thing rolling along, and it'd be good to sort of have a clear vision. In fact, that segues into what I did want to talk about, which is what are some of the things we want to prioritize for that group, because it is quite a lot. And what are, one, just are we happy with the name awareness and adoption as the bucket to try to cover this, knowing that it will be quite a bit more? And then two, of the things up there, what are some things that you flag as important first steps or things that we want to build contingencies around and things like that? Michelle.
I was just coming to the naming thing. I wasn't sure if you were suggesting that we try to discuss name here. I would propose that whoever's in that group, they can see what the process is, but let the group just rename itself if it needs to, just in the interest of time.
Great.
Alan,
Matt.
Hey, one last point, just to piggyback on my earlier comment. So, with respect to marketing, the Chamber hasn't taken a position on SBOM. I raised the point about marketing only because I think there's value in what you guys are doing, so I'm clear. I think there's value here. I just think that when I try to pull other parts of the business community into the discussion, it's hard, right? And so I see what you guys are doing, and I'm trying to think through how do I take the expertise that's in this room, a handful of folks, and leverage into a space where I think we can do some good. I think it's going to be a challenge, but I think one of the things I'm thinking through is how do we do that better, and that was the point of my point. I see the value. We haven't taken a position on SBOM.
Thanks. Good to know. Duncan.
Can we volunteer Matt for the awareness and adoption group?
We're going to sign you up for some working groups.
In fact, I'm very interested in when the timing of the demonstrations and how those unfold.
I think getting back to that, something that's a lot of power from those. So, looking at the awareness and adoption side of things, there's some work that can start to happen, sort of thinking about broader engagement and harmonization, some work where we're going to want to wait to hear from some other folks first. If you were going to suggest, again, not to hold, but just give the working group some things to think about as they define their charter and their near-term goals, what would you offer? Duncan.
I think a first order of business for each of the groups should be what do they need from the other groups, so that we don't get into these race conditions of one side's waiting for both sides are waiting for each other's side. So if there is something, if the tooling group needs info from awareness adoption, or awareness adoption needs something from tooling, or vice versa, it would be good to document those so that everyone is aware.
I like that. Other things that we would encourage the awareness and adoption group to sort of start with. Duncan.
So I assume I don't need the group's permission to promote SBOMs everywhere. So whenever I give talks, regardless of what I'm talking on, I always have an SBOM slide in there. And I don't know if other people do that. But if there is a certain amount of communication already going on, we probably should make each other aware of it. And if anybody has good decks explaining this stuff, I certainly would welcome stealing them. But so the sort of sharing of information we already have would be something I think would be good.
Having a canonical gold deck effectively for SBOM and explaining what this group is compared to other groups is probably useful. Can I add on to a different point?
Yeah.
Which is for the awareness and adoption, reaching out to the other groups that are working on things right now and helping to build on top of it rather than reinvent would be my encouragement. And I'm happy to connect people up there.
Thank you. Michelle.
Yeah, I was just going to, I also do a lot of rah-rah about SBOM when I speak. But I have seen a lot of value with having that standard deck we do that with, like, we've been doing that more and more often. And I was a really encouraging force for that, for some of the standards work we've done, because standards get released and people don't know what's in it and they don't want to buy it when they don't know what's in it. So I would really recommend that we have something like that, to your point. But also, originally when we had our framing report, when I originally put it together, I was expecting it to be an external facing document for people to understand what we're doing. I would think that there might be a value in having a persuasive, short, 2-page white paper that's also attached to the website, because you could look at our framing document and you can get all of that information about how to, what the baseline, all those things, but there is some really important stuff there that's buried at the back, which is the why do we need this, why is it valuable stuff that I think needs to be segregated out of that. So it's a 2-page or preferably 1-page executive summary with that compelling case put into it.
Oh, good.
So that kind of goes to the coordination, because our team did quite a lot of that on the practices side and didn't find its way into all the different areas where it could have been used, I think. So
I agree. And I think it is, the framing group did borrow heavily from
they borrowed quite a bit of it, but not enough to get to where
exactly. So
I was talking about.
Having the
right.
having the one-pager is useful. The one thing I'm going to push back, just because this is pushback that happened on Friday's call in the now awareness and adoption group, is what's the audience, right? The one-pager that you write for the C-suite is different than the one-pager you write for Matt Eggers, is different than the one-pager you write for the engineer. And so thinking through, do we want to write and one-pagers? I think there's a lot of value in that. It's going to be a non-trivial amount of work. Mike, sorry. Yeah, exactly. The different roles, producer, consumer, et cetera.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I just think the existence of those, and one of the things that I wrote in here is, I don't know if anyone has resources for this, but like if you look at the JSP from in the healthcare side, like they had an infographic that came along with their joint security plan. I think that this effort is screaming for an infographic that says, why should I make an SBOM? Why should I ask or demand an SBOM? Those two infographics, I think, could do more for this initiative than us going into every conference we speak at, because they get circulated, and people like infographics. There's a reason for that. So, I mean, but the thing is I don't have the skills to make an infographic. I don't know anyone who does, but it seems like somebody must know somebody who can help us and donate some artistic talent.
So
yes, Chris and then Lori.
Yeah, so we've actually, Synopsys themselves generated quite a bit of that material, and I know we have one that we would probably be willing to donate and clean up and donate some resources on that.
Thank you. That is, I appreciate that. Lori.
I think it goes a little bit, maybe do detailed discussions in sense of awareness adoption side, but I think if you go to the traditional marketing approach, then you will have actually people who are talking to customers and collecting the information from there, and based on that, all the sales materials will be produced. So that's kind of like, there have to be a information feedback. I don't know if it's possible to realize through the website survey or just a smart layout so you can see what is going to be the most interesting topic and so on. And based on that, you can start developing your workflow, basically.
It is fascinating that you mentioned a survey, because the awareness and adoption work that happened with vulnerability disclosure and under an NTIA process was exactly that, a snowball sample survey that got 400 hackers to sort of weigh in on what their concerns were. Duncan.
And I don't say we shouldn't do more surveys, but I do want to say we do have to make use of the information. The practices group did start out by surveying an awful lot of people, and so really a lot of data there is sort of buried away. We shouldn't forget that it's there.
All right. We have some marching orders. Today, we had a really good chance to sort of review what came out of it. And it's kind of cool to hear in 4 short presentations a solid year's worth of work. I just want you to go back to remember how niche the idea of an SBOM was last August. Right? That wasn't a brand new idea, but it was, in most places in software security, unheard of or indeed wildly unpopular. That's not true today. There are a lot of other things going on, but a lot of that work is because of what you guys did. The fact that this is now something that I think is going to come, and more importantly, is going to come not based on the fact that someone says, everyone must do it this way, but starting from real needs in the community. And I think that's incredibly important. Also think it's really great that almost everyone in this room recognizes that that's not enough, that there's still a lot of work to be done. And so I would personally like to thank you guys for still saying, yes, we're going to continue to do this work so that we actually can make the community better. So with that, we will take a break for now. Those of you who are here in Washington, D.C., there is a solidly mediocre pub that we end up at after this. Those of you on the phone and who've been watching, we'll be thinking of you. There's a lot more work to be done. We'll be sending out a lot more information, a very quick summary of what's to be done, and enjoy tonight because the calls start Thursday and Friday, where we actually get down to the real work. So, unless there are any last words, I will just very quickly check to make sure that there's no one on the phone. All right. Thank you all very much, and we look forward to continuing to work with you. Thank you.